Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob, and we are at our last show before the summer break. Rob, I want to hit you with a hard question to start this show tonight. Did Oscar Piastri do enough to earn us a shoey?
He absolutely did, Adam. What a result for the Aussie. I'm so happy for him. Although in the circumstances, maybe not the best outcome, but still very happy for Oscar. I knew the result was coming sooner or later, and I am hungry for more Hungary drama in the following races.
Fantastic. And we have a really exciting show to wrap up the first half for all of you. We're going to break down those winners and losers from Hungary and what it means for our last race of the first half. So we're going to get into some history of Spa, which drivers we think will be the best. And then Rob and I, for the first time ever, we're going to give you a little preview of what we think the rest of silly season is going to look like and how it could impact the fantasy game. So Rob, let's dive right into those winners and losers. Why don't you start us off this week?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I have Oscar as my first winner, and it was a result I knew was coming at some point before the mid-season break. McLaren have just looked so good since Lando got that breakthrough win in Miami, and I knew it was a matter of time after his podium in Monaco, also his season high at the time of 42 fantasy points in Austria, and then capped off a lot of that good momentum with his now season high 46 and that driver of the day. So a fantastic fantasy result. As I mentioned just before, maybe not the circumstances we would have liked to have seen. I still think Oscar won the race on merit. It was just a shame that the pit wall maybe bungled up a little bit of that race strategy there, but maybe that's a discussion for another time. But a great result for him. As I just said, 2 40-plus point performances in his last 3 races. So very happy for Oscar, and I'm sure that's going to continue into Spa and beyond the summer break.
We have a lot to talk about McLaren on the show tonight, and it's been a fantastic run for them these last few weeks. Now the 7th unique race winner of 2024, the first time since 2008 we've had that many unique race winners. And also, an exciting fact about Piastri, he's the only driver in the game to gain value in all 13 races this season. So a real proof of how strong Oscar's been as an asset throughout the season.
How is that he's the only driver to have scored double digits in every single race this season in fantasy? So a tremendous beacon of consistency, and I definitely think he's got the car right now to just build on that throughout the rest of the year.
Absolutely. And moving over to my first winner, it was George Russell. And I was worried about George after Saturday because he qualified P17, but that's only because he posted his fastest lap at a time where the track was drying. So by the time he pulled into the Mercedes garage, they had a lot of drivers behind him that were gaining on his time, knocked him out of that first session, but he had a great recovery run on Sunday. He finished P8 in the race, so that's 9 positions gain, and then he snatched the fastest lap too, so he ended up with 27 fantasy points, and all around a really good weekend for himself. And funny enough, this is his 4th race this season with exactly 27 points, which is second only to his race-winning weekend in Austria. So what a great comeback for Russell.
Mate, it's definitely a nice change of fortune for him. And he looked up until Silverstone the value for money guy in the B tier. I do think he's still delivering solid fantasy results for sure. So another driver that just seems to deliver that consistency you want from a driver under 25 million, but at a price point and in a car that is consistently featuring around the points, the high points most weeks. So happy for George. Owned him in Hungary, and I definitely could see that continuing beyond that race weekend as well. I actually want to cover off another winner in Sergio Perez, and you probably look at me and you go, why is Sergio Perez in the winner's circle this weekend? I wouldn't say in pure F1 he is, but in F1 fantasy, compared to how the points shook out in the B tier and generally, 20 points was a great result for him, a price rise much like George Russell and Oscar Piastri, and equally the same number of positions gained as George Russell. He also, as we know, didn't make it out of Q1 with that crash in the wall, another red flag in qualifying, which is becoming synonymous with poor old Checo. But the fact he was able to come from, within the bottom 5 to P7, a great result for him. His best result, honestly, since Miami. It's been the first time he's actually got over 20 points since that race weekend. So I suppose in the grand scheme of things, not a huge haul of points, but in terms of F1 fantasy production, I think that's a win for the Mexican.
One stat that makes me certain that Perez is a winner compared to his previous weeks is that he outscored Max Verstappen. When's the last time we said that? So another great recovery run, this time from Sergio Perez, but I think it was definitely underscored by some of his performance on Saturday. Second winner for me was, of course, the McLaren constructor. They continued their streak as the only team to send both drivers into Q3 in every single race. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on in our hit list. And this is their second straight week leading all constructors, and they had a season-high 74 points in the process. They looked fantastic. And at a time where the Red Bull team is in disarray, Ferrari's not totally back up to speed, McLaren is a must-have in every race, regardless of your budget moving forward, and they've really proven it this week.
Yeah, loving what we're seeing from McLaren. They've truly been the most consistent constructor, I'd say, since that Miami kind of juncture in the calendar, to be honest. They haven't had a race below 50 points since Miami, and the 74, much like Oscar's season high, is their constructor season high as well. So loving what we're seeing. That 1-2 finish, I don't think will be the last we see of them this season either. So happy for us McLaren owners. It's not a shame, but I suppose so many of us own them, it doesn't feel like quite as big a win as it might have been earlier in the season.
They're still the fourth most owned constructor, so there's clearly some zombie teams that have just lost the scent on which teams are doing the best right now. And I think the thing that I enjoy the most about McLaren is you're getting it right at almost every track, regardless of the track setup, regardless of the temperature conditions. They don't have strong circuits and weak circuits. They are the fastest car on merit pretty much everywhere we go. Rob, let's move over to the losers now. Can you walk us through your first loser?
Yeah, let me kick it off with Gasly. And I think up until we got to Silverstone, he was probably one of the picks of the bunch, I would say, in the C-tier asset class. Alpine looked to have really solved those problems that they had earlier in the season with the weight of the car. But now that they've solved that problem, reliability seems to be kicking in. And that's back-to-back. Well, I suppose it was a DNS in Silverstone and a DNF in Hungary, but back-to-back -20s. And I'm not suggesting he's going to score a hat trick of DNFs in a row in Spa, but I did some deep diving into Alpine's reliability earlier today, and they, over the last 3 seasons, or since the start of 2022, have the most DNFs post Silverstone among all teams. And it is quite a damning statistic, because we saw last year Ocon led all drivers with 7 DNFs and Alonso the year before with 6. So I wonder, Gasly's now at his 3rd DNF. Do we see a few more of those creep in later in the season? And you've talked about, how problematic engine component failures can be in the latter stages of the year. I'm probably steering clear of Alpine for the time being.
It's definitely gone from bad to worse to Alpine in these last few weeks, and I definitely remember that 2022 season with Alonso, feeling just so bad for him when he'd have all these mechanical failures despite some great runs. And for Alpine, they're now less reliable than Williams these days, which is pretty outrageous to think of. Yeah. And with the surge of RB and Haas, you now have enough strong midfield options where you don't need to take that risk. And so my hot take on Alpine, I think, has to go back on ice until they come back again in the second half. I hope.
Fingers crossed. Talk me through your first loser.
So my first loser is Nico Hülkenberg. It was a tough weekend for a driver coming off of consecutive P6 finishes, and it really started on the opening lap. He dropped from 11th to 15th right at the start. Haas pitted him quickly for hards to try that differential strategy, and for folks like him and Daniel Ricciardo that pit early, it didn't quite work for them. He managed to get back to 13th, but no higher, and so he ended up with 0 fantasy points. And so now one of the most reliable assets in recent memory has a goose egg for the first time since that disaster earlier in the season with the DQ and DNF, and he had a 0.2 million value drop. So you're expecting him to gain value or at least come out even. It was one of the biggest drops of the week.
Yeah, I feel terrible for Hülkenberg generally. I think we've probably got comfortable with the fact he's so good typically, and you look at his last 4 race results, 3 of them 14 or more points. So it is something we've maybe just become accustomed to and expected from him. And I'd say the fact he wasn't in Q3 maybe set him up for that differential tyre strategy as you talked about. But I do think that he still, even though it was, his 3rd lowest score of the season, I don't think that suddenly detracts from him as a fantasy asset. I fully expect I could be running him again in Spa just because of how good a driver he is. But it isn't great when you have a driver that is so reliable, and his teammate, what I think maybe rubs salt into the wound, had a $0.5 million increase and Hulk with a $0.2 million decrease. So that's a $0.7 million delta right there. So a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow.
And now it's time for us to pile on Red Bull. Do you want to start us off with Max?
Yes, sir. So Max, 17 points was his result in Hungary. And I think, even though he qualified P3, I certainly thought he was on for a very good shot at a podium, if not even a win, because we know how good he is typically. But It was just really a weekend to forget for him. A lot of back and forth with GP on the radio suggested Max is not comfortable in the car. It's not up to the standard he's probably used to. And I think that's more a product of the fact that McLaren are now so good that Max's old habits are probably creeping in. We just haven't seen those in a couple of years, but now there's a team and two drivers that are rivaling him at the front for wins. It is likely that we probably see a few more of these habits where he's making risky overtakes or rash decisions on track. And I think that's probably going to play into his fantasy scores a little bit too. That attempted pass on Hamilton lost him a couple of positions. And if we see more of that throughout the season, P3 to P5 could be the new norm for Max. So the fact that it was his worst score since Monaco and his third lowest all season makes me think that I don't suspect that the 17s are going to continue, but I also don't think we're going to suddenly start seeing 30 or 40 point hauls like we're probably used to.
It's definitely been a weird stretch for Max. He hasn't broken 30 points in 4 of his last 6 races, which coincides with a period where we've had 4 different race winners. And he's gone 3 straight races without a win for the first time. It's been 959 days since the last 3 race streak where we haven't had Max at the top step of the podium. And you think at the beginning of the year, 7 races, 7 poles, just 1 pole in the last 6. So clearly something is off with Verstappen. You had mentioned the arguments with GP on the radio. Sky had brought up his late night gaming the night before, his rage quit at the end of turn 1 on Lewis Hamilton. So it's definitely taking a corner for Max, and I'm worried that it's going to spill over into the next few races.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to suddenly start pointing his sim racing endeavors as a reason for why he didn't finish on the podium. I think maybe Crofty wants to have a go or two at him, but you never know. It is just another reason why people are going to poke holes at a bad result for Max Verstappen. I can see you've got Red Bull as your second loser, Adam. Talk me through that.
Now, I'm known for my patience to work through it as an asset, has a difficult time, but Red Bull is running out of chances for me. Perez has been outscored by Logan Sargent in 4 of his last 6. He's had some inexcusable incidents in 2 of the last 4 races, and things are just getting really difficult for the Red Bull constructor considering how expensive they are. Not to mention, in this last race, you're banking on fastest pit stops, and even though the DHL rankings have them as the number 2 fastest pit stop, I still need to investigate why they didn't get any in the game, but we got no points for it last week. So you didn't get half the teammate points. We didn't get the fastest pit stop points. Max dropped down to P5, and Checo didn't quite get up as high as we were hoping for with the overtake. So Red Bull are really struggling right now. And we're going to talk about what some of their outlook looks like in the next few races. But for me, they're starting to fall into the range where I have Ferrari, where I've got to sit you for a little bit and you need to prove to me that you're back before I trust you again.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. That's the problem. I think Perez, with those teamwork points, as you pointed out, the pit stops were probably offsetting that pit stop or that teamwork deficiency that Perez just wasn't able to contribute. But if they're not even able to catch a couple of pit stops, and maybe that 5 points is corrected before we get to the next deadline for their pit stop points, it's still probably not enough at that price at 28 odd million. You could definitely use that money elsewhere in your team to upgrade midfield drivers or upgrade an Alonso to a George Russell, for example. So I think it's just very hard to justify. And as you pointed out, we just got to wait until we see more consistency from them before they re-enter our thinking.
Absolutely. And we're going to be talking about Red Bull throughout this show, particularly what it means for them in Spa this weekend. But first, let's talk about Red Bull and our 5th Gear GARMS giveaway. And the question for this week is, will Max Verstappen win this weekend at Spa? And we're going to show you some data in the hit list that gives us a sense that Max really likes this circuit, but things have been really up against Red Bull lately. So do you think Max can win this weekend? Head over to our fan amp base, answer this question, and you'll be entered for a chance to win a great prize from our sponsor. Rob, what do you think?
It probably, had you asked me even a few races ago, it would be a no-brainer for me, but a couple of factors have probably decided why I don't think Max will win the Belgian Grand Prix. First of all, there's still a lot of speculation swirling around whether or not he takes these engine penalties, and we're going to get into that momentarily, but if he ultimately does take that, I'd say it's highly unlikely he wins at all, just because of how much further ahead McLaren are, and even the midfield are much stronger than they were 12, 18 months ago. So it's if he starts P11, P15, P16, he's going to have a much harder time passing the Magnusens, the Hulkenbergs, the Sonodas. And it just makes me feel much less confident that a win is as sure as it probably was a year or two ago. We've known that grid penalties at Belgium are something he really likes to take. Maybe I won't talk about this too much because I know we're about to jump into it, but I think that, and the fact that McLaren and Mercedes and the midfield generally have all moved ahead this season, not enough for me to pick Max. What about you?
I agree. I don't think he's going to win this week. Number one, because McLaren have two horses at the front of the race. They've been looking so good at every single circuit. And also, I'm taking a look at the weather, and it's going to be a little bit cooler again. And this is where Mercedes goes from good to great. He might have 4 cars at the front that he's going to contend with. So I'm going to say no for Max here. And also, in this space last week, we asked Alex Brundle which 3 drivers were going to score the most points at Hungary. It was either the Brit combination of Norris, Russell, and Hamilton versus the rest of world combination of Verstappen, Piastri, and Carlos Sainz. And it turns out Alex's team, the Brits, won by just 1 point. They had 1 fantasy point more than the other 3. So great job by our producer, Greg, to put that match together. All right, Rob, let's head down to the hit list. You had started teasing this history of Max taking engine penalties. Tell us a little bit about what we can expect this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about it quite a bit the last couple of weeks because there is always going to be an element of forward planning when you're bringing in someone valued at more than 30 million into your fantasy team. And it is going to probably require, if you do entertain it, should the penalty be confirmed, a little bit of financial feng shui in our F1 fantasy teams. I think it's probably going to need at least 3 transfers if you're running a team like a Lando Norris, Russell, and a Hülkenberg, which I am. And I think the fact that it probably means a -10 for a driver that doesn't look like he's in objectively the best car anymore just probably isn't worth it for me. So I think right now, even if he does take it, he could even start P20. He'll probably get at least 10 overtakes, 10 positions gained. But I want a sure thing in Lando Norris at the front as my 2X. I don't want to be gambling on someone fighting it out with the midfield guys, scrapping around, getting your elbows out, and risking the possibility of a collision. So for me right now, there is some upside and some serious appeal, certainly for a back of the grid drive for a driver of the day. But right now, probably not. What about you?
When this news first broke in Spain, where he took his last allocated part, and you can see on the screen which 4 he took, it seemed inevitable to me that he was going to take this penalty this weekend, and it had me really excited at the prospect of running him. But since then, I've really turned the page on Max, and I don't think he can do it this weekend. And you can see in the graphic here that when he's taken the engine penalty at Spa, he's gone on to win both of those races each of the last 2 years. In those 2 races, he ended up setting the highest fantasy score of the season. I just don't think he's capable of it this time just because of how competitive 2024 has been. And the RB20 simply doesn't have the speed advantage, like Rob mentioned a moment ago, of the RB18 and RB19, so he's not just going to fly through the field like he had in previous seasons. The one caveat I would say is it depends. If he takes 1 or 2 parts and falls to the bottom of the top 10, I think it's going to be a really tough sell because he's up against some very competitive cars that he probably won't be able to get through. If he takes a back of the grid penalty, maybe he can get 10 to 12 places gained, and that could be close to a break-even point. But like Rob said, unless you're really close to making that move, do you really want to take a -10 and radically shuffle your team for a flash in the pan and then totally reorient your team after the break? So it could be a little clumsy when it comes to the transfers to make it happen.
Yeah, exactly. Fully agree with all of that. And I think Max is probably the most obvious Red Bull route into our team for a grid penalty like this. The other one I would maybe give more thought to in years past, perhaps not now based on what we've just talked about, is the constructor. And I know you've run Red Bull for a couple of weeks. I had a 1-week punt in Austria and that was enough for me. But I do think there could be an opportunity for upside with the constructor if it was maybe earlier in the season when they have such an advantage. But Checo isn't quite delivering. And I know you've already got cold feet over the last couple of weeks from that alone. Talk me through the logic behind whether or not that could be an alternative differential for Spa.
I think for me also, because I've been scorned these last few weeks by Red Bull, I'm leaning more toward not running them, even if Max takes the penalty. You can see Checo's qualifying results. He's been out-qualified by Logan Sargent in 4 of the last 6. It's a stat that I'm going to take to my grave. I've been saying it all week. And, you know, it's funny. We had this moment during our live show where I'd locked in my team and looked up and the chat said, "There's rain on the circuit." And I said, "Oh no, Perez." and then it just came true not 10 minutes later. And looking ahead at Spa, a historically wet race, there's already rain in the forecast for Saturday that could drip into Sunday. I'm out on this guy.
Fair enough. I think Mercedes as a B tier asset and Ferrari as well, maybe slightly lower down the rung, a little bit more price gain upside as well. So if you can, I think, pivot to an A-B constructor lineup as opposed to a double A, there's probably a little bit more budget gain to be had with a driver in Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes, who is, as we know, an excellent wet weather driver as well. So if there's, as you pointed out just before, a little bit of rain in the forecast, that could pay dividends.
Rob, you mentioned Lewis, and I forgot to invoke. This was his 200th podium at Hungary last weekend. What a legend. I'm so glad for Lewis, and that was, I think, an underscored headline from the Hungarian Grand Prix.
200 podiums for Lewis is one of your favorite drivers. A maiden win for Oscar is my favorite driver. So great results all around for the fantasy formula.
Absolutely. Now, from a team in despair to the hottest group on the grid, I want to talk now about McLaren. And it's a no-brainer at this point. If you can afford to run triple McLaren, there's no safer option in the game right now. And like we mentioned a moment ago, the car has been fast everywhere. Wet, dry, hot, cool. And in the Constructors' Championship, McLaren have scored 214 points compared to Red Bull's 150 over the last 5 races, and they are storming back into the title fight. So the race is on now, Rob.
Yeah, I'm loving it. I think it's going to make for an exciting second half of the year. I think Drive to Survive producers are having an absolute field day just after Hungary alone, and it makes for a great viewing spectacle as well, because I know we've obviously seen a record-breaking season 12 months ago, and you know, when you're watching Max dominate week to week, it can get boring, but I honestly am in such admiration of how good of a driver he is. But it's such a great sign when we have such an open playing field every single race week. And in fantasy, there's so much variety right now that I love. Oscar Piastri, we've already talked about. A lot of people have piled in on him lately. As the only B-tier McLaren asset, I love Oscar as an asset heading into Belgium. You've got here on the screen as well, they are the only team to have 13 from 13 Q3 appearances for both drivers. So a huge boon for the constructor. More than 50% of the driver of the day vote. And Oscar, as we've talked about, his consistency recently has been phenomenal. So I definitely think there's going to be quite a few people moving towards that triple papaya lineup. I'm currently on 2. You're currently on 2. Do you think you could go for 3 at Belgium?
It's simply a matter of price for me. And unfortunately, with Oscar gaining all this value, I'm priced out of triple McLaren. I think that's the saddest headline of all of this news. I can't run all 3 of them. So I have to figure out what sacrifice I'm going to make this week. And you can see on the right that Oscar's been very consistent these last few weeks, and he's been at the top of the grid. And we owe him an apology. We had him in our loser space for a couple of races earlier in the season because he wasn't quite living up to where Lando was. Now it's getting to become pretty neck and neck over these last few races. So looking forward to see what that means for Piastri. If you can afford both of them, now all of a sudden this opens up autopilot. It opens up the 3X and 2X. So you have a lot of great options if you can afford this, and now you can run ahead from the rest of the field. So if you have the money to do it, definitely do it.
Probably a discussion for second half of the season, but wouldn't it be funny if we activate the 3X chip and Max Verstappen isn't in our thinking then? That would be something, but probably something to address when we get to the sprint races in the second half of the year. Oscar's a great segue into the 2 premium driver segment. Adam, I know you and I have debated over what the optimal combination is. Do you want to start us from the top with the double McLaren duo that we've just talked about?
Sure, because so this goes from the argument of if you can't have all 3 McLaren assets, what do you do? And so there are 3 options. You can see it on screen here. You can go with if you have the money to run all 3 of them, that's obviously the best one. There's the most popular lineup, one that Rob, you ran last week with Lando and George. And then there's a step down from that with Piastri and George. But the way with 2 tier B drivers, that could be the way to go as far as building cost cap. And then on top of that, there's a plan D, which is 1 premium driver and 4 premium midfield drivers. And last week in this space, you had shared some great data on how at Hungary, these midfield drivers tend to score fewer points. They tend to not get a cost cap game, and it played out exactly like that. And so now we have to figure out, will the script flip at a high overtake circuit in Spa, or should we duck into one of these 2 premium driver sets?
It is an interesting one, and I think reading into the historical trends of price changes year to year at each of the circuits actually is quite insightful. I looked at Belgium just to do a bit of a double click into how the C-tier asset prices shook out this time a year ago. More than 50% of them all went up 0.5 million. So I think that's certainly a trend that will continue this year. And I think, as you said, the premium, I don't know if I corrected myself when I was recording a video earlier this week. I corrected myself on saying premium midfield and back marker drivers because they are only 8 to 10 million. But I think in terms of the Haas drivers, the V-Carb drivers, they're probably on your shopping list if you're going for Lando Norris and reliable midfield options. I'm entertaining the idea of a Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, but to do that, it does involve two Sauber drivers and Logan Sargent, which when I look at it on paper, I'm not exactly wowed by that. So I may end up sticking with Lando and George for one more week, build a little bit more cost cap, and then move into the double or the triple McLaren lineup when the time seems more optimal.
I think that makes sense. And I think back to my interview with Andrew, who's Leapers One, who we're going to talk about later when we get to our league. He recommends if you're close to getting a good team, but you have to have, like what Rob said, 3 either Sauber or Williams drivers, just give it that extra time. Because if those midfield drivers all go up in value this week, it's probably because one of them DNF'd and lowered the average score anyway. So let that be someone else's problem.
Before we jump into our fourth topic on the hit list, do you want to take a punt at FanAmp's Pick of the Weeks?
Sure. Which of the 7 race winners this season will finish Q1 the highest? And this is definitely the first FanAmp Pick of the Week where we've had 7 options. Oh, Q1 is so hard to guess. So I'm going to take a stab and say Lando.
Okay.
And I don't have any data to support that.
Neither.
It is a dart throw.
I was going to say very much the same. I'm going to say Oscar, I think. Bit of momentum and confidence to carry into Belgium after his first race win in, I think, the strongest car on the grid. So I don't think he'll necessarily come out on top by the end of Q3, but I think he's certainly got a chance to have a good run at it before qualifying wraps up.
So feel free to head over to the FanAmp app, give us your predictions for this and the other questions we roll out every qualifying and Grand Prix session, and you have a chance to win some great prizes from FanAmp too. So let's have a little fun, Rob. Everyone's been predicting how silly season's going to finish but us. So why not take a stab at it ourselves?
Yeah, definitely. I know there's probably a few spicy picks you and I have got up our sleeves, and I don't think necessarily everyone I say will be 100% gospel, but I know silly season does have its twists and turns, so I'm going to have a bit of fun with you and we can figure out who lands where by the time all drivers have a seat at the end of the season. Do you want to start things off?
Sure. So let's see. The surest thing I can think of is this rumor of Esteban Ocon going to Haas, pairing with Ollie Behrman. I worry about what that means for a rookie's development because Ocon's had some problems with some recent teammates, but I think that's the surest thing that we're hearing of now, according to some of the multiple news outlets. And I think the next surest thing is probably Antonelli to Mercedes. Kimi had a tough start to the year, but we heard from Alex Brundle in our interview last week that Prama's struggled with the car to start the year. Behrman recently had a race win, and Antonelli had both a sprint win and a feature race win in each of the last 2 race weekends. So he's really starting to come around and he's starting to earn that seat.
Love it.
Let's see. For Williams, I think that's going to be our friend Valtteri Bottas and reuniting with Williams. He had such a great run with them the first time. I think he's going to be the odd man out, and Sauber's not going to re-sign him. So he makes a great compliment to Alex Albon and a revamped Williams team. And then let's see, which crazy news do I want to jump into first?
I feel like
go ahead.
These are the most open ones, these last 3, I think, because there seems to be a new driver linked to each of these last 3 seats. So I think we're going to have probably a bit of alignment on those first 3, but the next 4, if we're also looking at a Red Bull potential swap, we probably might have a bit of a disagreement.
So for Alpine, I'm going to go with Carlos Sainz because that's the prevailing news right now. Obviously, it's been changing with the weather the last few weeks, but I think Sainz is ultimately going to run out of time, and I think he's starting to burn bridges with the teams that have a seat left, so he's ultimately going to end up with Alpine, and hopefully they get those reliability issues sorted by then. And that leaves us with the last Sauber, RB, and potentially Red Bull. I think with his accident on Saturday, that is the end of Perez with Red Bull. And they're going to announce it later, but I think he's out for next year. And then with no seats left, he ends up with Sauber because he's good enough to be on the grid, but not good enough to be on Red Bull. And I don't think he can save face by going to RB. Okay. That means we have, I know Daniel's been leading this race a little bit, but I'm going to say Yuki to Red Bull and Liam Lawson in that last RB seat. And that is how I think the grid's going to go.
And then who ends up in the second RB seat?
Daniel.
Oh, Daniel does go there. Got it. Okay. So he stays for another year. Yuki gets promoted to the top team and Lawson makes his long-awaited debut in the sister team.
That's what I think happens. What about you?
I really like this. I'm not sure now if I reverse all of the drivers, what I could start with. I think, again, let's start with the obvious ones, as you pointed out. I think for me, the most obvious is Kimi to Mercedes. I thought for a minute it could be Sainz, but he's been linked to every single team on the grid this year. So I think Kimi seems like the natural fit for now. I think, again, Ocon to Haas, widely rumored he's going to have that seat announced probably in the next week or two. There was one driver that I don't see on here, and I don't think he's by any means the front runner for Alpine anymore, but Jack Doohan, up until those recent tests, seemed to be the lead favourite for that Alpine second seat. Now, I was talking to Terry a little bit after he came on the show, not most recently in Hungary, but I think just before that. And he speculated that Mick Schumacher and Zhou potentially are both hot shots for the Alpine seat. Now, I don't know. We know Mick is with Alpine in the World Endurance Championships, and I think he's put in a very good drive so far for Alpine and Mercedes as their reserve driver. I'm going to say, a little bit left field, I'm going to say Mick to Alpine. I don't know what is driving this assumption. I don't think it's necessarily the right one, but for the sake of a spicy pick, let's throw him in there. Now, the other thing I wanted to pick your brains on was stake. You had Checo in there, right?
I did.
I don't think he's bad enough to miss a season in F1. I think he fully deserves a seat on the grid next year. I don't know if I see him in stake, though. I suppose they've probably missed out on Sainz, right? They're probably going to miss out on Bottas. I don't think they're going to re-sign Zhou. But I think Perez probably loses. We've got 2 Ricardos. Yeah, I feel like Perez probably has to be somewhere, right? Because Lawson, Ricardo, Tsunoda. Maybe I'm going to say Perez has a year out from the sport. He's got a young family. Sits on the sidelines. Maybe reconsiders a return for a year in 2026. So as a result, I think Lawson, who's been so widely speculated as a potential RB replacement, but I think they might just thrust him in to the seat mid-season after the summer break as kind of a test run for him. They leave Daniel and Yuki in the RB. And if Lawson seems up to the task by the end of the season, they leave him in there for 2025. If they don't, I think they swap him and Yuki for the following year. And then I think Daniel, like you pointed out, stays at RB for another year. So that leaves us 2 slots. And Carlos Sainz doesn't have a seat on the grid. I think, and I agree, he's probably closely linked with Alpine because of Briatore's recent presence with the team. But I'm going to say he moves to stake. And I know that was probably the obvious pick 6 months ago. I feel like, as you've said before, he's probably burnt his bridges with Alpine. But I think that the long-term project, his connections to his father are not something that we should write off entirely. I think he's still thinking about it, but again, probably not the favorite. But for the sake of being a little different, I'm going to put him on stake. And then I think, like you, Valtteri moves to Williams. James Vowles has obviously said they want a reliable driver and they want someone who's buying in to the long-term vision of the team. So I really like Valtteri pairing with Alex.
That's a really, really bold grid you've got there, Rob, for next year. I hope we see Sainz with Sauber. I think that'd be a really good pairing. And I think it does make sense if Checo's a year out of the sport, comes back potentially with a higher team rather than setting a lower bar for himself and potentially being stuck at the bottom of the grid for the rest of his career. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think I'm going to get roasted for the Schumacher pick at Alpine, quite honestly. But I'm happy to wear that. I do think it's probably the most open seat at the moment. And I do think Sainz, as you said, probably deserves to be the favourite given how long he's failed to put pen to paper so far. But for sake of being different, let's go with something slightly varying to what you've got.
So Rob, to link this discussion to fantasy, let's talk about if there's action in season. You know, the most likely guys to get replaced in season at this point are Perez and Logan Sargent. Let's talk a little bit about what happens if they make that move, because we've seen it go 2 ways. Last year with AlphaTauri, they made 2 driver changes, and in both of those, the driver that came in assumed the price of the previous driver. And so that made Daniel Ricciardo a really affordable asset, and then Liam Lawson in cleanup duty while Ricciardo was injured. Meanwhile, earlier this season, we had Ollie Behrman come in for one race in place of Carlos Sainz at the top of the grid. Sainz was at 18.8 million at the time for Jeddah, and Behrman came in at 14 million, and he ended up being a steal. So I wonder if both of those moves happen, if Logan's replacement comes in at his current price, and then if Perez is replaced, we might have a bargain alongside Max Verstappen.
Yeah, I think the Logan one's a little difficult to gauge because they have at Williams talked about potentially bringing in someone, or I don't think they've publicly announced this, but it's possible they do bring in someone mid-season for Logan. I just don't know who they put in there, right? It could be Antonelli, I suppose, with the Mercedes links. But there was talk of maybe Ocon leaving his contract with Alpine early, but I don't think that went anywhere. Who else are they going to put in the seat other than maybe Antonelli? I just don't see it happening. But I do think, as you pointed out, with Ricciardo and De Vries, whoever comes in to replace Logan, should that happen, probably will just be at the same price. Logan's at a bargain bin price as well of just over 5 million. So it's probably a steal, if you ask me, for someone who's going to be a bit more reliable, regardless of who that person is, for the rest of the season. On the topic of a possible Red Bull replacement, I know you had Yuki in there. Do you see that happening after the summer break, Yuki being promoted to the senior team? And if so, do you think that his price will jump up to kind of closer to what Behrman's was when Sainz took a leave of absence for one race?
I think it just depends how Checo does in these next few races. He had this moment last year where he really turned the corner, got Red Bull back into their winning ways, helped them ensure the Constructors' title again. If they continue to circle the drain, McLaren overtakes them in the championship, they might do something drastic in the last third of the season to try to recover and get that Constructors' title back, and also put Checo on the shelf, sort of save him from himself. So I think really his fate is in his own hands these next few races. I think he's probably out of that seat for next year, but are they willing to make a move in season, and how would that upset just the rest of their driver program across the two teams? We'll see what Red Bull's appetite for that is.
Yeah, definitely agree. Definitely like that. I do think whoever comes into that Red Bull second seat, if it's vacated before the end of the year, is probably not priced at Checo's current price. If it's Ricciardo, Tsunoda, or Lawson, whoever the driver is, they'd probably be priced identically, but I think it'll probably be less than 20 million. So we could have a bit of a steal on our hands in that Red Bull.
So Rob, from the difficult decisions in silly season to the difficult decisions we have for Spa this weekend, do you want to walk us through 3 lineups for 3 budgets?
You've got it. So the first price bracket we are looking at this week is 114 million, if I'm not mistaken. So I think there's probably a couple of different ways we could go with this. I myself haven't put a great deal of thought, but I think between you and I, we can cobble together some lineups. I think the obvious starting point is probably Mercedes and McLaren, right, in the Constructors?
Agreed.
So let's start with that. And then we start with the 2X driver. Who's your pick there?
So I think one flavor, because this is a lower budget team, I would do Lando, double Haas, Tsunoda, Sargent. And that way you've got a lot of stabs at getting some price gains between 2 of the top midfield drivers, 4 price gains, Lando, who consistently gains price, a Tier B constructor, Mercedes, and Yuki, who's been locked in these last few races.
Yeah, true. I think at Spa as well, you want drivers with higher price upside, so I really like that. You could also go for a double Sauber Logan, if we just quickly pivot out of that, going the other way. And I know there's probably a little bit more risk in this, but we have seen some people already move towards, lineups with double McLaren, double Mercedes, and that might just get you inside that 114 million as well. So a couple of different options, but I do like for Spa probably the 3 premium C-tier assets.
Agreed.
And then the next one's a 119, if I'm not mistaken, but stick with the same 2 constructors. What do you reckon?
That's right. I have McLaren and Mercedes in every single build across the 3 price tiers.
So we probably want to start with Lando, right, as our obvious 2X?
That's right. And then, so this is a little bit of no man's land at 119 because you can't quite afford Piastri. And if you do three premium tier C assets, you're leaving some money on the table. One idea I had was very similar to what you've run in recent weeks, Rob. Lando with George, and then Joe, Sargent, Sonoda.
Sargent, Sonoda. Okay. I like that.
So then you've got a few options to grow in price. You've got a little bit of risk at the bottom of your team, but overall pretty good point scoring lineup.
Yeah, no, I do like the Sonoda option. I think you could also swap out if you don't like the V-carbs. I think there's probably just enough for a house. Oh, Kevin Magnussen might actually just be a bit too much, but you could also go for Ricciardo. You could also go for Gasly. You could also go for Hülkenberg. But I, as you said, am running Sargent and Joe, so it's something I've probably just made my bed with and have to stick it out unless I choose to overhaul my team entirely.
I like it. And now for 124 million and the moment we all want to get to on our fantasy teams, because this is triple McLaren with Hülkenberg, Sonoda, and Sargent, a really, really good team all the way around.
Yeah, I do think that anyone who can afford, obviously I can't squeeze in, I could probably put Hülkenberg in, but assume there's just enough budget to get Sargent in as well. I really like this because you're not banking on two drivers that are probably going to drop in price like a Sauber or a Sargent. You've got a Hülkenberg who typically does go up in price most weeks. Sonoda, the V-carb, improving again, point on the weekend. So I think if you can go for a team like this, extremely envious.
Absolutely. And I think with this team, if you can afford triple McLaren, you're ahead of everyone else and you have the ability to press further ahead if you keep it up. So I would definitely stick with this. I wouldn't be tempted by anything with Verstappen, Red Bull, combinations of better midfield drivers where you'd have to sacrifice Piastri. At this point, I think you have a true 1A, 1B driver in your lineup.
Yeah, I really like it. I still think Lando is probably a lock for me in terms of the 2X most weeks. But Oscar is approaching 25 million as an A-tier asset. So I would say try and capitalize on what we've got left with Oscar until he does breach that $25 million threshold, and then maybe pivot back down to a George Russell or a Lewis Hamilton if the price rises aren't quite as steep as Oscar's are right now. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, Oscar's now tied with Charles Leclerc. So it is quite telling that McLaren really do have the momentum, and I don't think that's stopping anytime soon.
Absolutely. And so we'll be keeping in touch throughout the rest of the week in case there are any changes to our lineups. We'll start mapping out what it looks like if Verstappen takes that penalty, if we hear any news at the end of the week. And Rob, let's talk about now the Fantasy Formula Featured League and see where our leaderboard stands. And you can see our friend Andrew Leapsfrog is still in first. He ran triple McLaren, double Haas, Sonoda, and Mercedes, so his budget is prime right now.
I was super envious when I clicked on Andrew's team yesterday. I don't know too many people who can afford a lineup like that. And as you said, Adam, the ability to have those reliable midfield drivers and the top two drivers and constructors in the game right now makes me think that that's a very easy hold for the next few races. I mean, if you had a team like that Andrew has, is there even a need to make a transfer in Spa?
No, I doubt it. I would keep that exact same team. And Andrew's actually now P2 in the Global League, moved up one spot from last week, and I think he's headed for global domination at this point if he keeps it up. Also, a quick shout out to the team called Hey They're Here, who used their 3x DRS boost on Piastri and 2x on Russell for 337 points to lead all teams last week. So, Rob, we will be back this Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern, 1 hour ahead of qualifying for the Belgian Grand Prix. Terry will be back, Rob and I will be back, the contest will be back, and it will have one great show with all of you before the summer break. I'm really looking forward to it.
Can't wait, Adam. Let's make it a good one. Oscar won last week. Maybe it's another shoey to close out the first half of the season on the stream. So, as you said at the very start, probably got to hold myself to that promise. But very much looking forward to finishing our last show in the first half of the year with a bang. And very much looking forward to closing out my fantasy result as well, hopefully with another green arrow.
It's a shoey party this Saturday, and you're all invited only on the FanAmp YouTube channel. Be sure to join us. Until then, thank you all for watching.